There is a moment in the first season of Invincible where Nolan Grayson stands in the wreckage of what used to be a mountain. His sun is broken beneath him. There is blood on every surface, some of it marks, some of it belonging to people whose names Nolan will never know. And Nolan is screaming. Not a battle cry, not the roar of a conqueror. He is screaming because his son, barely conscious, voice cracking, has just said 4 words that dismantled an entire identity. You, Dad. That is what Mark said. Just that. You, Dad. And the most powerful being on the planet flew away because he had no idea what to do with the feeling he had spent centuries learning to suppress. If you were to sit a psychologist down and ask them to explain Nolan Grayson, they would not start with his powers. They would not start with the Viltrumite Empire, or the Guardians of the Globe, or even the massacre that opens the series. They would start with a question that sounds almost too simple. What happens when someone who was taught that love is weakness discovers that love is the strongest thing they have ever encountered? That is the question at the center of Omni Man, and it is the question that makes him one of the most psychologically rich characters in modern animation. The thing about that question is that it does not have a clean answer. It is not the kind of question where you plug in the right variables and a solution falls out. It is the kind of question that psychologists build entire careers around, because it sits at the intersection of so many different areas of the field. Developmental psychology asks how a person's earliest experiences shape their capacity for love. Social psychology asks how the groups we belong to define what we believe love even is. Clinical psychology asks what happens when the structure of a person's identity is threatened by an emotion they were never given the tools to process. And personality psychology asks whether someone who has lived a certain way for centuries can become, in any meaningful sense, a different person. Nolan Grayson touches all of those questions. He does not answer them, because the answers are not simple, and the show is smart enough to know that. But he touches them, and the way he touches them is the subject of what we are going to talk about tonight. If any of this sounds like the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing to the channel genuinely helps us keep making these longer videos. It is completely free, and it means more than you might think. Now, to understand why a psychologist would find Nolan so fascinating, you first have to understand what he was before he ever set foot on Earth. And that requires going back not just to his origin story, but to the psychological architecture that built him. The Viltrumite Empire is not simply a militaristic civilization. It is, in clinical terms, one of the most complete systems of psychological conditioning ever depicted in fiction. Every element of Viltrumite society is designed to produce a very specific kind of person. Someone who equates strength with value. Someone who sees emotional vulnerability as contamination. Someone who can commit acts of extraordinary violence without internal conflict, because the framework they were raised in has already resolved all the moral questions for them. You are strong, therefore you are right. You conquer, therefore you matter. You feel nothing for the conquered, because feeling something would make you less than what you are. This is not simply authoritarianism. A psychologist looking at the Viltrumite system would recognize something much more targeted. This is indoctrination in the clinical sense. Indoctrination differs from ordinary socialization in a critical way. Socialization teaches you the norms of your group while still allowing for internal disagreement. You can be raised in a particular culture and still develop your own moral compass, even if it diverges from the values around you. Indoctrination does not permit that. Indoctrination works by collapsing the distance between belief and identity. You do not merely believe in the Empire. You are the Empire. Your value as a person is indistinguishable from your value as a soldier. If you question the mission, you are not simply being rebellious. You are failing to be yourself. That is what makes it so effective, and that is what makes it so hard to undo. Think about what that means in practice. When you grow up inside a system like that, your sense of self does not develop independently of the ideology. They grow together, intertwined, like two trees planted too close together whose roots have tangled underground. You cannot pull one out without damaging the other. Your pride, your self-worth, your understanding of your place in the world, your sense of what it means to be good, all of these things are woven into the ideology so tightly that separating them feels like self-destruction. And in a very real psychological sense, it is. Leaving a totalistic ideology is experienced neurologically as a kind of death. The old self has to die for the new self to be born. And dying, even metaphorically, is the thing that all living creatures are most motivated to avoid. Nolan was raised inside that system for centuries, not decades, centuries. To put that in perspective, most of what we know about the psychology of indoctrination comes from studying cults and totalitarian regimes that operate on the scale of years or decades. The longest-running experiments in ideological conditioning that we have data on involve maybe 40 or 50 years of sustained exposure. Nolan had hundreds of years in which every authority figure, every peer, every cultural narrative, every reward structure, and every punishment reinforced the same set of beliefs. Strength is virtue, conquest is purpose, emotion is corrosion, and the weak exists to be ruled or discarded. The depth of that conditioning is almost impossible to overstate. Consider what it means to live inside a single ideological framework for 300 years. Every friendship you have is with someone who shares the ideology. Every romantic relationship, if Viltrumites even have those in any conventional sense, is conducted within the ideological frame. Every story you hear, every piece of art you consume, every historical account you learn, all of it is filtered through and reinforced by the same worldview. After 300 years, the ideology is not something you believe. It is the medium you think in. It is the water you swim in. You do not notice it any more than a fish notices water, because it is everywhere and it is all you have ever known. Asking Nolan to question Viltrumite ideology after 3 centuries is like asking you to question the existence of gravity. Not because Viltrumite ideology is as self-evident as gravity, but because it has been present in his experience with the same constancy and the same apparent naturalness. When a psychologist talks about deeply held beliefs, they often distinguish between beliefs that are held and beliefs that are constitutive. A held belief is something you think is true. A constitutive belief is something that defines what you are. You can change a held belief with new evidence. Changing a constitutive belief requires something much more dramatic, because it does not feel like updating your knowledge. It feels like dying. You are not learning that you are wrong about something. You are learning that the person you thought you were does not exist. For Nolan, the Viltrumite worldview was not a held belief. It was constitutive. It was the architecture of his selfhood. And when that architecture started to crack, it did not crack quietly. But here is where it gets interesting, because Nolan was not simply a loyal soldier who arrived on Earth and carried out his mission. If he were, there would be no story. The story exists because something went wrong with the mission, and the thing that went wrong was that Nolan started to feel. The assignment was straightforward, at least by Viltrumite standards. Go to Earth, integrate, pose as a superhero, gain the trust of the population, weaken the planet's defenses from within, prepare for eventual conquest. It was an infiltration mission, and Nolan was selected because he was good at it. He had done similar things before. The Viltrumites had a long history of sending agents to planets they intended to absorb, and the playbook was well established. You go in, you pretend. You wait, you deliver the planet when the time comes. But pretending has a cost that the Viltrumite Empire never fully accounted for. And this is where a psychologist would start to lean forward, because what happened to Nolan on Earth is one of the most well-documented phenomena in the study of undercover operatives and deep cover agents. It is called identity absorption, and it happens when someone spends so long performing a role that the role begins to rewrite the performer. There is real research on this. Studies of undercover law enforcement officers, intelligence agents, and even method actors have shown that prolonged immersion in an assumed identity creates genuine psychological change. The brain does not distinguish cleanly between a role you are playing and a life you are living, especially when the role involves forming real relationships, making real decisions, and experiencing real emotions over extended periods. The longer you play the part, the more the part becomes you, not metaphorically. Neurologically, the neural pathways associated with the assumed identity become as robust and well-worn as the pathways associated with the original identity. And at some point, the question of which identity is real stops having a clean answer. The research on undercover officers is particularly illuminating here. There are documented cases of law enforcement agents who spent years embedded in criminal organizations and who, upon extraction, found that they had genuinely changed. Their values had shifted. Their loyalties felt confused. Some of them experienced what researchers called identity erosion, where the boundary between the cover identity and the real identity became so blurred that they could not reliably tell which thoughts belonged to which self. Several experienced severe depression and anxiety upon returning to their normal lives, not because the undercover work was traumatic in the conventional sense, but because they had lost track of who they actually were. The cover identity had become so real, so lived in, so neurologically established, that removing it felt like removing a limb. Now multiply that by 20 years and add genuine love. Nolan lived on Earth for over 20 years. He married Debbie Grayson, he raised a son, he went to work, he came home. He sat at the dinner table, he attended school events, he mowed the lawn, he argued about small things and reconciled afterward. He built, piece by piece, day by day, a life that was supposed to be a cover story. And somewhere in those 20 years, The cover story became the truth. Not all at once, not in a single moment of revelation, but gradually in the way that all real change happens, through accumulation, through 10,000 small moments that individually meant nothing but collectively meant everything. Think about what those 20 years actually looked like from the inside. Nolan waking up next to Debbie on a Tuesday morning with nowhere to be. The smell of coffee in a kitchen that has become familiar over years. Mark as a toddler, reaching up. Mark learning to ride a bicycle. Mark having a bad day at school and Nolan feeling something protective stir in his chest that is not part of any mission protocol. The first time Debbie laughed at something he said and he realized that the warmth he felt in response was not performed, it was real. Each of these moments by itself meant nothing, but they accumulated. They deposited layers of meaning, the way sediment deposits layers of rock. And eventually the accumulated layers became a structure that was as solid and as real as anything the Viltrumite Empire had ever built inside him. A psychologist would call this cognitive dissonance, and it is one of the most important concepts for understanding Nolan's psychology. Cognitive dissonance is the state of holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time and experiencing psychological distress as a result. Nolan's two contradictory beliefs were these. First, that Viltrumite ideology was correct, that strength was the only thing that mattered, that Earth was a planet to be conquered, and that the people on it were essentially insects. Second, that his life on Earth was meaningful, that his relationship with Debbie was real, that his love for Mark was genuine, and that the identity of Nolan Grayson, husband and father, was not merely a mask but an authentic expression of who he had become. These two beliefs cannot coexist. They are fundamentally incompatible. And cognitive dissonance theory tells us that when a person holds incompatible beliefs, they will experience increasing psychological pressure to resolve the contradiction. The resolution can go in one of three directions. You can abandon the first belief, you can abandon the second belief, or you can find a way to compartmentalize, to keep both beliefs alive by never allowing them to occupy the same mental space at the same time. Nolan chose compartmentalization. For 20 years, he kept the warrior and the father in separate rooms inside his mind. And for 20 years, it worked. Until it did not. The thing about compartmentalization is that it is not a stable solution. It is a delaying tactic. The contradictory beliefs do not go away just because you have put them in different rooms. They are still there. They still exert pressure, and the energy required to keep them separated increases over time, because the beliefs themselves tend to grow. The warrior identity does not sit quietly in its compartment. It demands expression. It demands acknowledgement. It whispers that the life you are living is a lie and that you are wasting yourself on creatures who will be dust in a few decades. And the father identity does not sit quietly either. It grows roots. It forms connections. It becomes load-bearing. And the more load-bearing it becomes, the harder it is to contain, because you are leaning on it. You are depending on it. It is no longer a role you can take off at the end of the day. Nolan's compartmentalization lasted 20 years, which is a long time by human standards, but a blink by Viltrumite standards. And the fact that it eventually failed is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that the contradictions had become too large to contain. Something was going to give. And when it gave catastrophically. The massacre of the Guardians of the Globe is the moment when the compartmentalization fails. And what makes that scene so psychologically devastating is not the violence itself, although the violence is extreme. What makes it devastating is the look on Nolan's face when it is over. Go back and watch it. Watch JK. Simmons' voice performance in the moments after the Guardians are dead. There is no triumph. There is no satisfaction. There is something closer to exhaustion, or maybe grief, or maybe the specific kind of numbness that descends when you have done something that you knew you were going to do, but hoped somewhere in a part of yourself that you do not fully acknowledge, that you might somehow avoid. A psychologist would recognize that moment immediately. It is the look of someone who has just betrayed one of their core identities in service of another. Nolan killed the Guardians because the warrior demanded it. The mission demanded it. The Viltrumite in him demanded it. But the father, the husband, the man who had spent 20 years building a life that felt real, that part of him watched it happen and understood that something had just been broken that could not be repaired. Not the Guardians. Something inside himself. And notice the method. Nolan does not simply overpower the Guardians. He invites them to a meeting. He stands among them. He waits until they are gathered and unsuspecting. And then he strikes. This is not the behavior of a proud warrior. This is the behavior of someone who knows he cannot afford to hesitate, because hesitation would give the father identity time to object. The massacre is quick and brutal because it has to be. If Nolan had given himself time to think, he might not have gone through with it. The speed of the violence is itself a psychological tell. it reveals a person who is afraid of his own conscience. This is where Albert Bandura's theory of moral disengagement becomes essential. Bandura was a psychologist who spent decades studying how ordinary people justify doing terrible things. His research showed that humans do not simply flip a switch and become capable of atrocity. Instead, they go through a series of cognitive maneuvers that gradually disable their moral self-regulation. Bandura identified 8 mechanisms of moral disengagement, and Nolan uses nearly all of them at various points in the series. The first is moral justification, where you reframe a harmful action as serving a higher moral purpose. Nolan does this when he tells Mark that the Viltrumite conquest of Earth will ultimately be beneficial, that humans will be better off under Viltrumite rule, that he is doing this for their own good. The logic is familiar. It is the logic of every empire that has ever claimed its conquests were civilizing missions. And like every civilizing mission in history, it is a story the conqueror tells himself so he does not have to face what he is actually doing. The second is euphemistic labeling, where you use sanitized language to describe harmful actions. Nolan does not say he is going to help destroy Earth's autonomy. He says he is preparing it. He does not say he killed the Guardians. He says he did what was necessary. The language is precise in its imprecision. It acknowledges the act while stripping it of its moral weight. This is not unique to Nolan. It is a universal feature of how people who do terrible things manage to sleep at night. You do not commit murder, you neutralize threats, you do not invade countries, you liberate them. The words change, but the mechanism is always the same. The third is advantageous comparison, where you justify your actions by comparing them to something worse. Nolan does this explicitly when he tells Mark about what happens to planets that resist the Viltrumites. The implication is clear: cooperation leads to a managed transition, resistance leads to annihilation. Therefore, what Nolan is doing is actually the merciful option. He is saving Earth from a worse fate. This is, of course, the logic of the protection racket. It would be a shame if something happened to this nice planet you have here. But Nolan does not experience it as a threat. He experiences it as a genuine argument. And that is what makes moral disengagement so dangerous. It does not feel like rationalization from the inside. It feels like reason. The fourth mechanism is displacement of responsibility. This is where you attribute your actions to the demands of an authority rather than to your own choices. Nolan displaces responsibility onto the Viltrumite Empire, constantly. He was sent here. He was given orders. He is a soldier following a directive. The implication is that the moral weight of his actions belongs to the Empire, not to him. He is merely the instrument, and again, this is psychologically familiar. It is the core finding of Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments. When people believe they are acting under the authority of a legitimate institution, they will do things that would otherwise horrify them, and they will experience reduced moral distress while doing so, because the responsibility feels like it belongs to someone else. The fifth is diffusion of responsibility, where the moral weight is spread across a group rather than concentrated on an individual. Nolan is not the only Viltrumite. He is one of many. The conquest of Earth is not his personal project. It is an institutional initiative. When responsibility is shared among thousands, it becomes thin enough that no single person needs to bear the full weight of it. This is why atrocities are more common in organizations than in individuals. Not because organizations attract worse people, but because organizations provide a structure that allows the moral cost to be distributed until no one person feels responsible enough to stop. The sixth mechanism, and perhaps the most important one for understanding Nolan, is dehumanization. And this is where the Viltrumite ideology does its most insidious work. Because Nolan does not merely look down on humans. He has been taught at the deepest level of his identity that they are categorically different from him. Not just weaker, not just less advanced, fundamentally other. The Viltrumite word for it is telling. Humans are pets. They are not people in the way that Viltrumites are people. They are something lesser, something that exists in a different moral category altogether. Dehumanization is one of the most studied phenomena in psychology, and the research on it is chilling. When you categorize a group of beings as less than human, your brain literally processes them differently. Neuroimaging studies have shown that when people view images of groups they have dehumanized, the regions of the brain associated with social cognition, the parts that activate when you think about other people's thoughts and feelings, show reduced activity. You are not just treating them as less than human, your brain is actually perceiving them as less than human. The dehumanization is not merely rhetorical, it is neurological. For Nolan, who has been immersed in a dehumanizing ideology for centuries, the neural patterns associated with seeing humans as inferior would be deeply, deeply entrenched. This is not something you can undo with a single realization. It is something that has to be overwritten, slowly, through repeated experiences of genuine connection with the dehumanized group. And that overwriting is exactly what happened during Nolan's 20 years on Earth. Every genuine conversation with Debbie, every moment of pride in Mark, every time he laughed at a human joke or was moved by a human story, or found himself caring about the outcome of a human conflict. Each of those moments was a small act of rehumanization, a tiny correction to centuries of dehumanizing conditioning. And eventually, the corrections accumulated to the point where the dehumanization could no longer hold. This is crucial for understanding the train scene, because the train scene is not merely an act of violence, it is the moment when dehumanization and rehumanization collide inside the same person at the same time, and the result is a psychological explosion. But before we get to the train, there is something else that needs to be examined, and that is Nolan's relationship with Debbie, because it is one of the most psychologically complex relationships in the entire series, and it raises questions that do not have comfortable answers. When Nolan arrived on Earth, Debbie was part of the cover. She was the wife in the fake identity. The relationship was supposed to be instrumental, but over 20 years, something happened that Nolan did not plan for and could not control. He fell in love, and a psychologist would want to spend a long time on that because the question of whether that love was real is not as simple as it sounds. There is a concept in psychology called the parasocial trap, but the version that applies to Nolan is actually closer to something called genuine attachment within a false context. It works like this. The context of the relationship is false. Nolan is not who he says he is. His reasons for being with Debbie are not what he has told her. The foundation of the relationship is a lie. But the emotions that developed within that false context are genuine. The affection is real. The comfort is real. The habit of turning to her when the day has been long, the sound of her voice is a form of home. The specific way she laughs at something he says that is not even that funny. All of that is real. And this creates an almost impossible psychological situation because the emotions are authentic, but the container they exist in is fraudulent. Some psychologists would argue that this makes the relationship inherently abusive, regardless of how Nolan felt about it. And they would have a strong case. Because consent requires information. Debbie consented to a relationship with a person who did not exist. She consented to a life that was built on a foundation she was never told about. And you cannot truly consent to something when the most fundamental facts about it have been hidden from you. This is not a technicality. This is the core of what consent means. Debbie's love for Nolan was based on a version of him that was, at best, incomplete, and at worst, entirely fabricated. But here's where it gets complicated, because Nolan's love for Debbie was also based on a version of himself that was incomplete. The Viltrumite warrior did not love Debbie. The Viltrumite warrior was incapable of loving Debbie. It was the identity that grew up around the mission, the emergent self that took shape over 20 years of pretending, that developed genuine feelings. So in a strange way, neither of them was in a relationship with the real version of the other. Debbie was in a relationship with a partial Nolan, and Nolan was in a relationship as a partial version of himself. The whole thing was built on incompleteness, and yet the emotions were real on both sides. A psychologist would find that genuinely difficult to categorize, because most of our frameworks for healthy versus unhealthy relationships assume that the people in them are who they say they are. There is a further layer of complexity that is worth exploring here. Debbie, voiced by Sandra Oh with a specificity and emotional honesty that elevates every scene she is in, is not a passive figure in this dynamic. She is a fully realized person with her own psychology, her own needs, and her own agency. And her love for Nolan, even though it was based on incomplete information, was not delusional. It was based on real interactions with a person who, within the scope of their shared life, behaved in ways that were genuinely loving. Nolan was present. Nolan was attentive. Nolan was, within the confines of his assumed identity, a good partner. And Debbie's response to that, her trust, her investment, her love, was entirely rational given what she knew. The fact that she did not know everything does not make her feelings foolish. It makes Nolan's deception cruel. There is an asymmetry of knowledge here that places the moral weight entirely on the deceiver, not on the deceived. Now, there is another framework that some people apply to Nolan and Debbie's relationship, and it needs to be addressed directly, because it comes up often and it is more complicated than it first appears. That framework is Stockholm Syndrome. The argument goes something like this. Debbie was trapped in a relationship with someone who was, unbeknownst to her, vastly more powerful than she was, and fundamentally dishonest about his nature. When she eventually learned the truth, she experienced the classic signs of traumatic bonding, the oscillation between fear and attachment, the difficulty in fully separating from someone who has hurt you, the way the memory of the good times becomes almost more powerful after the betrayal than it was before. And there is real psychological truth in that reading. Debbie's response to learning the truth about Nolan does follow some of the patterns associated with trauma bonding. She is devastated, then angry, then drawn back into complicated feelings of attachment that she does not want to feel but cannot fully control. She drinks, she struggles, she rebuilds. But the attachment keeps pulling at her because 20 years of genuine emotional connection do not simply evaporate when you learn that the context was false. The emotions persist even after the foundation has been revealed to be fraudulent. And that persistence, that inability to simply shut off feelings that you know are based on lies, is one of the hallmarks of trauma bonding. But a careful psychologist would push back on a pure Stockholm Syndrome reading, for a couple of reasons. First, Stockholm Syndrome in the clinical sense requires that the victim be aware of their captivity. It is a response to a known threat. Debbie did not know she was in danger for most of their relationship. She was not bonding with her captor as a survival strategy. She was bonding with someone she genuinely believed was her partner. The dynamics are different. What Debbie experienced is closer to betrayal trauma, which is a related but distinct phenomenon. Betrayal trauma occurs when someone you depend on for survival or emotional security turns out to be a source of danger. And the psychological response to betrayal trauma is not the same as the response to captive bonding. It is in many ways worse. Because with Stockholm Syndrome, there is at least a clear framework. You know you are a captive. You know your feelings are complicated by your circumstances. With betrayal trauma, the ground itself shifts. You do not know what was real and what was not. You do not know which memories to trust. Your entire history with the person becomes suspect. And the work of recovery involves not just processing what happened, but reconstructing what was true. This is what Debbie goes through. And it is one of the most realistic depictions of betrayal trauma in animation. The drinking, the anger, the guilt for still caring, the way she looks at photographs and cannot decide if the person in them was real or a character. That is betrayal trauma, and the fact that the show gives Debbie space to work through it, rather than resolving it in a single episode, is one of the things that makes Invincible psychologically honest, in a way that most superhero stories are not. There is a particular moment that captures Debbie's psychological state with painful clarity. It comes after the reveal, after Nolan has left, when Debbie is alone in a house that used to feel like home and now feels like evidence. Every object in that house is a relic of the life she thought she had. The couch where they sat together, the kitchen where they cooked, the bedroom where she slept next to someone who was, the entire time, something she could not have imagined. And the psychological task facing her is not just grief. It is ontological. She has to rebuild her understanding of reality itself. What was real? What was performance? Whether the distinction even matters when the feelings were genuine on her side. Psychologists who work with survivors of long-term deception describe a phenomenon called reality testing disruption. It is what happens when the fundamental framework you use to interpret your experiences is revealed to be unreliable. You do not just lose trust in the other person. You lose trust in your own perception. If you could be wrong about this, the person you shared a bed with for 20 years, what else are you wrong about? The betrayal destabilizes not just the relationship, but the self. And rebuilding from that destabilization is one of the hardest things a person can do, because the tool you need to rebuild with, your own judgment, is the very thing that has been compromised. But let us return to Nolan, because his psychology becomes most revealing and most disturbing in his relationship with Mark. And this is where attachment theory becomes essential. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth, is one of the foundational frameworks in developmental psychology. It describes the patterns of emotional bonding that form between children and their primary caregivers. And it argues that these early patterns shape how we relate to other people for the rest of our lives. There are 4 main attachment styles. Secure attachment, where the child feels safe and trusts that the caregiver will be there. Anxious attachment, where the child is uncertain about the caregiver's availability and becomes clingy or distressed. Avoidant attachment, where the child learns that the caregiver is emotionally unavailable and adapts by suppressing their own emotional needs. And disorganized attachment, where the caregiver is simultaneously a source of comfort and a source of fear, creating a paradox that the child cannot resolve. Nolan's attachment style, formed over centuries of Viltrumite conditioning, is textbook avoidant, not anxious avoidant, not fearful avoidant. This is the attachment style that develops when emotional expression is consistently punished and emotional self-sufficiency is consistently rewarded. In Viltrumite culture, showing emotional vulnerability is not just discouraged, it is dangerous. A Viltrumite who shows too much feeling is a Viltrumite who will be culled. The Empire is explicitly eugenic. They select for strength and eliminate weakness. And emotional sensitivity is classified without ambiguity. as weakness. So Nolan learned, centuries before he ever held his son, that attachment was something to be controlled, managed, and ideally eliminated. He learned that the safest emotional posture was one of distance. You could be near someone without being connected to them. You could live with someone without needing them. You could even care about someone in a limited, carefully circumscribed way without ever allowing that caring to become something that could be used against you or that could compromise your mission. And this is exactly how Nolan approached his relationship with Mark for the first 17 years of Mark's life. He was present, he was not absent. He showed up, he played the role of father, but there was always a distance, a held-backness, a sense that the affection was being carefully metered rather than freely given. Mark could feel it. Children always can. Attachment research has shown that children are extraordinarily sensitive to the emotional availability of their caregivers, and they adjust their own attachment behavior accordingly. Mark's attachment style, interestingly, seems to be anxious-secure, someone who forms strong bonds but carries an underlying worry about whether those bonds will hold. And that maps perfectly onto what it would be like to be raised by a father who was there but not fully there, who loved you but always seemed to be holding something back, who could be warm in one moment and inexplicably distant in the next. There is a concept in attachment research called the still face paradigm. It was developed by Edward Tronick, and it involves a caregiver suddenly becoming emotionally unresponsive to their infant, maintaining a neutral blank expression instead of the usual engaged and responsive one. The infant's response is dramatic and immediate. They become distressed. They try to re-engage the caregiver. They cry. They look away and then look back, checking to see if the caregiver has returned. And if the still face persists, the infant eventually gives up and withdraws into a state of apparent helplessness. Now, Nolan did not give Mark a literal still face, but the emotional equivalent, those moments of unexplained withdrawal, of warmth, suddenly replaced by distance, of a father who was present in body but occasionally absent in spirit, would have produced a similar effect at a subtler level. Mark would not have been able to name what was happening, but he would have felt it. And his response, the anxious, secure attachment style, the need to prove himself, the desire to earn his father's approval, the underlying fear that the approval might be withdrawn, all of that would have its roots in those micro-experiences of emotional unavailability. But here's the thing that makes Nolan's relationship with Mark so psychologically significant. Despite the avoidant attachment style, despite the Viltrumite conditioning, despite the fact that Mark was, in some sense, an unplanned variable in a mission that was supposed to be clinical and controlled, Nolan formed a genuine bond with his son. Not just a functional bond, not just the kind of pragmatic attachment that a handler forms with an asset. A real, deep, neurologically embedded bond that was, by the time Mark was 17, one of the most important psychological structures in Nolan's entire identity. And he did not know it. That is the key. He did not know how attached he was until the attachment was threatened. This is extremely common in avoidant individuals. They suppress awareness of their own emotional needs so effectively that they genuinely do not know how much they care about someone until the relationship is in crisis. And then the realization hits all at once, not as a gradual dawning, but as a kind of psychological avalanche. And the person is overwhelmed by feelings they have no framework for processing. This is exactly what happens to Nolan in the first season finale. And to understand why the train scene is the way it is, you have to understand that Nolan is not simply being cruel. He is having a psychological breakdown. The train scene is one of the most viscerally disturbing sequences in modern animation. And it should be, because it depicts something that is psychologically real and deeply uncomfortable. It depicts the moment when a person who has been compartmentalizing two incompatible identities is forced to choose between them, and the choosing breaks them. Nolan has revealed the truth to Mark. He has told him about the Viltrumite mission. He has asked Mark to join him, and Mark has refused. Now, for a psychologist, this is the critical moment, because Mark's refusal does not just threaten Nolan's mission. It threatens the compartmentalization that has been holding Nolan together for 20 years. If Mark refuses the Viltrumite identity, then Nolan has to choose. He is either a Viltrumite warrior who sees his son as a failed recruit, or he is a father who loves his son regardless of ideology. He cannot be both. The compartments have been breached, and they cannot be sealed again. And Nolan chooses the warrior. At least, he tries to. He beats Mark. He beats him badly. He grabs him and flies through a city, using Mark's body as a weapon against the very people Mark was trying to protect. And then the train. Nolan holds Mark in front of a moving train, and people die. Civilians die. And Nolan screams at Mark, asking him why he is making him do this. A psychologist would stop everything to analyze that line, because it is one of the most revealing things any fictional character has ever said. It is a textbook example of what is called externalization of responsibility, and it is one of the most common verbal patterns in abusive relationships. When an abuser says, "Why did you make me do this?" they are performing a very specific cognitive operation. They are taking their own choice, their own agency, their own decision to inflict harm, and they are relocating it outside of themselves. They are rewriting the causal chain so that the violence originates not in their own will, but in the behavior of the victim. You made me do this. If you had just listened, if you had just obeyed, if you had just been what I needed you to be, none of this would have happened. The violence is your fault. Your disobedience caused this. Your failure to comply is the reason people are dying. This is psychologically devastating for the person on the receiving end because it weaponizes their own conscience against them. Mark, who is already being physically destroyed, now has to contend with the suggestion that the destruction is his fault. That if he had just agreed, if he had just gone along with it, the civilians on the train would still be alive. And the terrible thing is that there is a twisted logic to it that a traumatized mind can almost accept. If Mark had said yes, the train scene would not have happened. Therefore, Mark's refusal is a but for cause of the deaths. But of course, this logic is a trap. The actual cause of the deaths is Nolan's choice to kill. Mark's refusal did not cause the violence. Mark's refusal was the morally correct response to an immoral demand. The violence was Nolan's response to not getting what he wanted. And the fact that Nolan cannot see this, the fact that he genuinely experiences the violence as something Mark forced him into, tells you everything about how deep the cognitive distortion goes. But here is where a psychologist would add nuance that the surface reading might miss. Nolan is not simply deflecting blame in the way that a calculated manipulator would. He is in genuine psychological crisis. The compartmentalization has collapsed. The warrior and the father are occupying the same space for the first time in 20 years, and the result is something close to a dissociative episode. Nolan is not fully in control of what he is doing. Not in the sense that he lacks physical control of his body, but in the sense that his cognitive architecture is fracturing in real time. He is oscillating between two identities so rapidly that neither one can fully assert itself, and the result is erratic, contradictory, escalating behavior. He beats Mark and then hesitates. He makes the argument for Viltrumite supremacy and then looks at his son's face and falters. He kills civilians and then screams about it as if someone else is doing it. He is, in clinical terms, decompensating. Decompensation is a term used in psychology to describe the failure of psychological defense mechanisms. When someone has been managing their internal contradictions through compartmentalization, denial, rationalization, or any other defense mechanism, and those mechanisms suddenly fail, the result is decompensation. The person becomes unable to function according to their usual patterns. Their behavior becomes unpredictable. Their emotional regulation collapses. They may do things that are wildly out of character, or they may cycle through contradictory behaviors in rapid succession. This is Nolan on that train. This is Nolan holding his broken son and screaming. The escalation of the violence is itself a psychological symptom. Nolan does not start at the maximum. He escalates, and each escalation is an attempt to force a resolution to the internal conflict. If he can just be brutal enough, if he can cross enough lines, then maybe the father identity will finally give up. Maybe the conscience will stop objecting. Maybe he can get back to the clarity of the warrior, where violence is simple and justified and does not require screaming. But the father will not give up. Every act of violence produces not resolution, but more distress. Every line he crosses makes the internal conflict worse, not better. He is trapped in a feedback loop where the thing he is doing to try to make the pain stop is the thing that is causing the pain. And then Mark says it. You, Dad, you. What will you have after 500 years? And Nolan stops. He just stops because those words do something that no amount of force could have done. They cut through the decompensation and speak directly to the identity that Nolan has been trying to suppress. Not the warrior, the father. Mark is not arguing with the Viltrumite. Mark is calling out to his dad, and his dad hears him. A psychologist would call this a breakthrough moment. And they would also tell you that breakthrough moments are among the most dangerous and unstable states a person can be in. A breakthrough is not a resolution. It is a cracking open. It is the moment when the defended self is suddenly exposed and all the feelings that were being held back come flooding in at once. Nolan does not stay and process this. He cannot. The feelings are too large, too sudden, too incompatible with everything he has been for centuries. So he does the only thing his psychology will allow him to do in that moment. He runs. He leaves Earth. He flies away from the only people who ever made him feel something real. because feeling something real is the one thing his entire psychological architecture was designed to prevent. The image of Nolan flying through space, alone, crying, is one of the most psychologically honest images in the entire series. It is the image of someone who has just had their entire identity structure shattered and who has no idea how to exist in the aftermath. He is not going somewhere. He is going away from something, and the something he is going away from is not Earth, or Mark, or Debbie. It is the version of himself that Mark just called into existence, the father. The man who cares. The person who cannot reconcile centuries of violence with the fact that his son's voice can still reach him. Now, there is something important that needs to be said here, and it is something that a psychologist would insist on. Understanding Nolan's psychology is not the same as excusing his behavior. This is a distinction that people sometimes struggle with, because our culture tends to conflate explanation with justification. If you explain why someone did a terrible thing, people sometimes hear you saying that the terrible thing was acceptable. But that is not how psychology works. Psychology explains. It does not excuse. The train scene is an atrocity. Nolan's breakdown does not make it less of an atrocity. The civilians who died are still dead. Mark's injuries are still real. Debbie's trauma is still valid. Understanding the psychological mechanisms behind Nolan's behavior helps us comprehend what happened, but it does not reduce the moral weight of what he did. And this matters because the question of whether Nolan can be redeemed is one of the central questions of the series, and it is a question that psychology has a lot to say about, even if the answers are not comforting. After leaving Earth, Nolan goes to Thraxa, and what he does on Thraxa is psychologically fascinating, because it is in essence a repetition. He forms another relationship, he has another child, Oliver. He builds another version of the life that he just destroyed. And a psychologist would recognize this immediately as a pattern called repetition compulsion. Repetition compulsion is one of Freud's most enduring observations, and it has been validated by subsequent research, even by psychologists who reject most of Freud's other ideas. The basic principle is this: when a person has an unresolved psychological conflict, they will unconsciously recreate the conditions of that conflict over and over again, hoping each time that the outcome will be different. It is not a conscious strategy. The person is not aware that they are repeating the pattern. From their perspective, they are simply making choices that feel right in the moment. But from the outside, the pattern is unmistakable. Nolan goes to Thraxa and does exactly what he did on Earth. He integrates into a society. He forms a bond with a woman. He has a child. The details are different, but the structure is identical. And a psychologist would ask, what was he hoping would be different this time? What was the unresolved conflict that drove him to recreate the same scenario? The answer, most likely, is that Nolan was trying to prove something to himself, not consciously, not deliberately. But at the deepest level of his psychology, he was trying to prove that he could do what he failed to do on Earth. He was trying to have a family without it destroying him. He was trying to be a father without the fatherhood undermining his identity as a warrior. He was trying to find a way to reconcile the two selves that had torn him apart. But of course, repetition compulsion does not work that way. The whole point of the concept is that the repetition does not resolve the conflict. It just reenacts it. And sure enough, Nolan's time on Thraxa ends in Crisis 2, though the nature of the crisis is different. There is something else about Thraxa that is psychologically revealing, and it is the speed of it. On Earth, Nolan took 20 years to form attachments. On Thraxa, the process was much faster. He had a child almost immediately. He settled into domestic life without the years of gradual identity absorption that characterized his time on Earth. And a psychologist would see this acceleration as significant. It suggests that the capacity for attachment, which took 20 years to develop the first time, was now readily available. The neural pathways were already built. The emotional infrastructure was already in place. Nolan did not need to slowly grow a new identity on Thraxa because the identity of father already existed. It had been forged on Earth, and it did not die when he left. He brought it with him, and on Thraxa, it simply reactivated. This is important because it tells us something about the nature of Nolan's transformation. It was not a temporary anomaly. It was not a brief malfunction in an otherwise functional warrior's psyche. It was a genuine structural change, a rewriting of his psychological architecture that could not be undone by distance or time. The father identity was not the cover story. The father identity was the mutation, and once a mutation takes hold, it does not simply revert. When Mark finds Nolan on Thraxa, the dynamics have shifted. Nolan is no longer trying to maintain the compartmentalization. The compartments are already broken. He has seen what he is capable of, and he has run from it. But he has not processed it. He has not done the psychological work of integrating the warrior and the father into a coherent self. He has just moved the problem to a new location and hoped that geography would do what introspection could not. And this is where the psychological concept of avoidance becomes important. Avoidance is one of the core symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and it manifests in many ways. You can avoid places that remind you of the trauma. You can avoid people who were involved. You can avoid conversations about what happened. You can avoid your own thoughts and feelings through substance use, workaholism, or constant activity. Or you can do what Nolan did and avoid the entire planet where the trauma occurred by flying to a different world and starting over. But avoidance does not heal trauma. It preserves it. The traumatic material remains unprocessed, stored in the nervous system in its raw, unintegrated form, waiting to be triggered. And when it is triggered, the response is just as intense as it was the first time, because the nervous system does not know that time has passed. Trauma exists outside of time. It is always happening right now, in the present tense, in the body's memory. And no amount of geographic distance can change that. Nolan on Thraxa is a man running from himself. And when the Viltrumite Empire catches up to him, as it inevitably does, the psychological pressure becomes even more extreme. Because now he is not just dealing with his internal conflict, he is dealing with the external manifestation of the identity he has been trying to escape. The Empire is there. The warriors are there. The ideology that shaped him is right in front of him, demanding his loyalty. And he has to decide again who he is. But before we get to how he decides, there is something worth sitting with for a moment. And it is the question of what Nolan's inner life actually looks like during the period between leaving Earth and being found on Thraxa. Because from the outside, that period looks like flight. It looks like a powerful being crossing the void between stars, moving from one world to the next, restless and purposeless, and eventually settling on a planet that is not Earth. But from the inside, from the psychological inside, that period would have been something much more specific and much more devastating. It would have been grief, not the clean, contained grief of a person who has lost someone they loved. Something more total than that. Something closer to the grief of a person who has lost themselves. There is a concept in psychology called ambiguous loss, developed by the therapist Pauline Boss, and it describes a particular kind of grief that arises when the loss is unclear or unresolved. In one form, the person you have lost is physically absent but psychologically present. They are gone, but you do not know if they are gone forever. In the other form, the person is physically present but psychologically absent. They are here, but they are not really here. Nolan's situation after leaving Earth contains elements of both forms, but twisted inward. He is physically present to himself, obviously. He is still alive. He is still conscious. He is still flying through space. But the person he was on Earth, the husband, the father, the man who sat at the dinner table and carved turkey at holidays, and woke up next to someone warm, that person is psychologically absent. That identity has been shattered by the train, and the person he was before Earth, the Viltrumite warrior, the conquering agent of Empire, that person is also psychologically absent, because the conscience that emerged on Earth has made it impossible to simply return to that identity without revision. Nolan is grieving both of his selves simultaneously, the earthbound self that he destroyed with violence, and the Viltrumite self that was destroyed by love. A psychologist would recognize this as one of the most disorienting forms of grief that exists, because there's no stable platform from which to grieve. Normally, when you lose something, you grieve from the vantage point of what you still have. You lose a job, but you still have your family. You lose a relationship, but you still have your sense of self. You grieve the lost thing while standing on the thing that remains. But Nolan has no platform. Both selves are compromised. Both identities are in ruins. He is grieving from the middle of the wreckage, with no solid ground to stand on. And this kind of groundless grief does not follow the orderly stages that popular psychology has taught us to expect. It does not move neatly from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance. It swirls, it cycles, it ambushes. You think you have processed something, and then you turn a corner and it is right there, as raw as the first day. And you realize you have not processed it at all. You have just been distracted from it. The flight through space, the arrival on Thraxa, the rapid formation of a new family, all of it can be understood as Nolan's attempt to outrun the grief. But grief is not something you can outrun, especially when the thing you are grieving is yourself. It travels with you. It is the same speed as you, always, because it is inside you. It is not a thing you carry. It is a thing you are. And Nolan, for all his power, for all his ability to cross galaxies in the time it takes a human to drive to work, cannot move faster than his own mind. There is another dimension to Nolan's post-Earth psychology that is worth examining, and it connects the personal grief to something much larger and much older. It is the cumulative psychological toll of centuries of violence. We have discussed moral injury as a concept, and we have discussed perpetrator trauma. But what has not been fully explored is what happens when those things accumulate over a time span that is almost beyond human comprehension. Consider what Nolan's memory contains. Not decades of experience, centuries, hundreds of years of conquest, of planetary subjugation, of violence conducted at a scale that makes human warfare look like a bar fight. And all of that was held in place by an ideological framework that said it was not only acceptable, but noble. The framework was the container. It kept the memories organized, categorized, justified. This happened because it needed to happen. Those beings died because they were lesser. That civilization was destroyed because it refused to submit. The ideology did not just motivate the violence. It metabolized it. It processed the raw material of atrocity into something the psyche could absorb without breaking. But when the ideology fails, the metabolic function fails with it. And suddenly, centuries of memories that were previously organized and justified become centuries of memories that are unprocessed and unjustifiable. The container has broken, and everything it was holding is now loose inside the mind, sloshing around with no framework to give it structure or meaning. This is not a metaphor. Neurological research on belief change has shown that when a core belief system is disrupted, the memories associated with that belief system do not simply update to reflect the new understanding. They have to be individually reprocessed, reevaluated, and restored. And for someone with centuries of memories to reprocess, the cognitive demand is staggering. This is why the PTSD framework, while useful, is not quite adequate for understanding Nolan's post-awakening psychology. PTSD is typically understood as a response to a specific traumatic event or a circumscribed period of traumatic exposure. The diagnostic criteria describe symptoms that persist for more than a month after exposure. But Nolan's exposure was not a single event or a circumscribed period. It was his entire life. Every year of his existence, from early Viltrumite training through centuries of conquest, was saturated with experiences that, viewed through the lens of his newly emerged conscience, constitute trauma. He does not have PTSD in the clinical sense, because there is no pre-trauma baseline to return to. There is no version of Nolan that existed before the violence. The violence was there from the beginning. It is woven into the fabric of who he is. What Nolan has is closer to what some clinicians have begun calling complex moral injury, which describes the cumulative effect of repeated moral transgressions over an extended period, particularly when those transgressions were committed within an institutional framework that sanctioned them at the time. The research on this is still emerging, conducted primarily with veterans of prolonged conflicts and with former members of organizations that engaged in systematic harm. But the clinical picture is consistent. People with complex moral injury do not simply feel guilty about specific acts. They feel contaminated. They experience a pervasive sense that they are damaged at a fundamental level, that the accumulation of their actions has altered what they are in a way that cannot be reversed by any amount of good behavior. And they often struggle with the question of whether they deserve the relationships and the life they are trying to build, because the shadow of what they did follows them into every room, every conversation, every moment of connection. Nolan carries this contamination. You can see it in the way he holds himself in later scenes, in the comics especially. There is a heaviness to him that is not physical. It is the weight of centuries pressing down on a conscience that is still learning how to bear it. And the question that haunts him, the question that sits behind every interaction he has with Mark, with Debbie, with anyone who represents the life he is trying to build, is whether a person who has done what he has done has the right to want what he wants. Whether the desire for love, for family, for connection, is itself a form of selfishness when it comes from someone with his history. Whether reaching for redemption is noble or presumptuous when your hands are as stained as his. This brings us to one of the most important psychological concepts in Nolan's arc, and it is one that does not get talked about enough. It is the concept of earned secure attachment. In attachment theory, most of the research focuses on the attachment styles that form in childhood and the ways they persist into adulthood. But there is a growing body of evidence that attachment styles are not fixed. They can change. And the mechanism of change is called earned security. Earned security occurs when a person with an insecure attachment style, through sustained corrective emotional experiences, develops the capacity for secure attachment that they did not have before. It is not easy, it is not fast, and it is not guaranteed, but it is possible. And the way it works is through relationships. Specifically through relationships with people who are consistently emotionally available, who respond to vulnerability with acceptance rather than punishment, and who demonstrate through their behavior over time that attachment is safe. Mark is this person for Nolan, not because Mark is trying to be. Mark is not Nolan's therapist. Mark is not trying to heal his father. Mark is just being Mark, which is to say, he is being someone who loves his father despite everything, who was angry and hurt and betrayed and still, underneath all of it, reaches out. And that reaching out, that persistent, stubborn, infuriating refusal to give up on the relationship is the corrective emotional experience that Nolan's psychology needs. But earned security does not happen in a single moment. It happens over time, through repeated experiences of emotional safety. And Nolan's journey from avoidant warrior to someone capable of genuine attachment is long and uneven, and full of setbacks. There are moments when he slides back into the Viltrumite mindset. There are moments when the old patterns reassert themselves, and he becomes cold, distant, dismissive. There are moments when the cognitive dissonance flares up again, and he does not know who he is. And this is psychologically accurate. Change is not linear. Recovery is not a straight line. It is a spiral, where you revisit the same issues at different levels of depth, and each time you come back to them, you have a little more capacity to deal with them than you had before. The spiral model of change is important for understanding why Nolan's arc can feel frustrating to watch. If you expect change to be linear, if you expect that each step forward will be followed by another step forward, then Nolan's periodic regressions will look like failures. But if you understand that change is a spiral, then the regressions are not failures, they are part of the process. Each time Nolan falls back into Viltrumite thinking, he comes out of it a little faster. Each time the old patterns reassert themselves, they hold for a little less time. The warrior identity is not gone. It may never be fully gone, but its hold is weakening, and the father identity is growing stronger, and the overall direction of travel, despite the regressions, is toward integration. In the comics, Nolan's arc eventually leads him to a place where he openly defies the Viltrumite Empire. He fights against the ideology that created him. He stands beside his son and chooses, explicitly and irrevocably, the identity of father over the identity of warrior. And this choice costs him dearly. It costs him status, safety, centuries of identity, and ultimately his life. Because in the comics, Nolan dies fighting Thrag, the leader of the Viltrumites, in a final battle that is about much more than political allegiance. It is about a man proving, to himself and to his son, that the person he became on Earth was the real one, that the 20 years he spent as a husband and father were not a cover story. They were the truth. A psychologist looking at Nolan's death in the comics would have a lot to say about it. They might talk about the concept of narrative identity, which is the idea that human beings construct their sense of self through the stories they tell about their own lives. Nolan's final act is, in essence, a revision of his narrative identity. He is rewriting his own story. The old story said that he was a Viltrumite warrior who was temporarily weakened by human emotion. The new story says that he was a father who was temporarily trapped inside a warrior and who found his way out. They might also talk about the psychology of sacrifice, which is a deeply studied phenomenon. Why do people give their lives for others? The evolutionary psychology answer involves kin selection, the idea that you will sacrifice yourself for your genetic relatives because their survival carries your genes forward. But the psychological answer is more nuanced. People sacrifice themselves when their identity has become so bound up with another person or a set of values that the loss of those things would constitute a form of death anyway. If Nolan had survived but failed to protect his family, the person who survived would not have been Nolan in any meaningful sense. The identity of father, which had become his primary identity, would have been destroyed. The sacrifice is not about choosing death over life. It is about choosing which version of yourself gets to be the real one. There is also the fight with Thrag itself to consider, because the psychological dynamics of that confrontation are specific and revealing. Thrag represents everything Nolan used to be. He is the purest expression of Viltrumite ideology. He is the strongest. He is the most committed. He has no attachments, no divided loyalties, no emergent conscience complicating his sense of purpose. Thrag is what Nolan would have been if the mission to Earth had gone according to plan. He is the road not taken, made flesh and blood and capable of punching through mountains. Fighting Thrag is, in a very real psychological sense, fighting the version of himself that Nolan has been trying to kill for years. Not the physical version, the ideological version. The part of him that still whispers, somewhere beneath the layers of new identity, that strength is all that matters and that everything he has felt since coming to Earth is contamination. Thrag is that whisper given form. And defeating Thrag, or rather, choosing to fight Thrag knowing that the fight will almost certainly be fatal, is Nolan's way of silencing that whisper permanently. Not through suppression, not through compartmentalization, through action, through the most decisive, irreversible action available. He does not suppress the warrior. He turns the warrior against the ideology that created it. He uses the strength to destroy the source of the strength's corruption. And that, psychologically, is the only way the cycle could end. A psychologist who works with survivors of cult indoctrination would recognize this dynamic. There often comes a moment in recovery when the former member has to actively confront the ideology, not just intellectually, but emotionally and behaviorally. They have to do something that the ideology would condemn. They have to break the rules in a way that is visible and irrevocable, and that burns the bridge back. Because as long as the bridge back exists, as long as there is a theoretical possibility of returning to the old belief system retains its power. The bridge has to be burned. And for Nolan, fighting Thrag to the death is the burning of the bridge. There is no going back after that. The Viltrumite identity is not merely dormant. It is finished. And what remains is the father. Just the father, stripped of everything else, bloody and broken and dying, but finally, for the first time in centuries, whole. There is also something worth noting about Nolan's relationship with Oliver, the son he had on Thraxa. Oliver represents a different kind of psychological challenge for Nolan than Mark does. Mark was the child who was raised in ignorance of Nolan's true nature, and who had to discover the truth through trauma and violence. Oliver was born into a situation where Nolan was already fractured, already running, already struggling with the contradictions that had torn his first family apart. Oliver did not have the benefit of 20 years of relatively stable, if emotionally metered fathering. Oliver got a version of Nolan that was already in crisis. And yet, Nolan's attachment to Oliver is real. It is perhaps less complicated than his attachment to Mark, because there's less history between them, less accumulated guilt, less wreckage, but it is also less tested. The depth of an attachment is not just a function of how strongly you feel it. It is a function of how it behaves under pressure. And the attachment to Mark has been tested by the worst thing a father can do to a son. It has survived that. It has survived the train. It has survived the betrayal and the violence and the flight and the years of distance. The fact that it survived all of that is what makes it so psychologically significant. It is not just attachment. It is attachment that has been through fire and come out the other side. Battered, scarred, permanently altered, but intact. Now, there is a question that hangs over all of this, and it is the question that makes Nolan's story genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. And the question is this: can an abuser genuinely change? This is not a theoretical question. It is a question that affects real people in real relationships, and the psychological research on it is mixed, in a way that does not provide easy comfort to anyone. The honest answer is, it depends. And what it depends on is a set of factors that are specific enough to be useful. The first factor is the nature of the abuse. Was the abusive behavior a product of specific circumstances, such as extreme stress, substance use, or a psychotic episode? Or was it a reflection of a stable personality trait? If the behavior was situational, the prognosis for change is better. If it is characterological, the prognosis is worse. Nolan's case is complicated because his abusive behavior is partly situational, a product of the impossible psychological pressure of his dual identity, and partly characterological, a product of centuries of Viltrumite conditioning that normalized violence and dominance. The second factor is insight. Does the person understand what they did, why they did it, and the impact it had on others? This is not the same as feeling guilty. Guilt is an emotion. Insight is a cognitive achievement. You can feel terrible about what you did without understanding the psychological mechanisms that led to it, and you can understand those mechanisms without feeling anything at all. Genuine change requires both. Nolan develops insight over the course of the series, but it comes slowly and unevenly, which is realistic. The third factor is accountability. Does the person take responsibility for their actions without minimizing, deflecting, or blaming the victim? This is where Nolan's journey is most fraught, because his early responses to confrontation are full of minimization and deflection. The Viltrumite conditioning makes it almost impossible for him to say, simply and without qualification, what I did was wrong. I chose to do it, and the people I hurt did not deserve it. That kind of unqualified accountability runs directly counter to everything he was taught about strength and weakness. Admitting fault in the Viltrumite framework is the same as admitting weakness, and admitting weakness in the Viltrumite framework is the same as inviting death. The fourth factor is sustained behavioral change. Does the person actually behave differently over time, not just in moments of crisis or remorse, but consistently across different contexts, over an extended period? A single act of heroism does not constitute change. A single apology does not constitute change. Change is measured in patterns, not in moments. And patterns take time to establish. The fifth factor, and this one is often overlooked, is the willingness to sit with the discomfort of what you have done without seeking premature resolution. This means not rushing to be forgiven, not demanding that the people you hurt acknowledge your growth. not treating your own transformation as a story that entitles you to a happy ending. Genuine accountability includes the acceptance that you may never be forgiven, that the damage you did may never be fully repaired, and that the work of being a better person is its own reward, not a transaction that earns you absolution. This is extraordinarily difficult for anyone, and for someone with Nolan's psychology, where the need for control and the avoidance of vulnerability are so deeply ingrained, it is almost impossibly hard. Nolan's arc, particularly in the comics, does show sustained behavioral change. He does not simply have one moment of realization and then become a different person. He struggles. He backslides. He has moments of Viltrumite coldness that frighten the people around him. But the overall trajectory, the long, slow trend line, bends towards something that resembles genuine transformation. He becomes more emotionally available. He becomes more willing to express vulnerability. He becomes more capable of putting his family's needs ahead of his own impulses. And he does this not because someone forced him to, but because the corrective emotional experiences provided by his relationships with Mark, with Debbie, with Oliver, gradually rewired his attachment patterns. But here is the uncomfortable part. Even if Nolan has genuinely changed, that does not erase what he did. The Guardians of the Globe are still dead. The people on the train are still dead. The psychological damage to Mark, to Debbie, to everyone who trusted him is still real, and the question of whether the victims of his violence are obligated to forgive him or to accept his redemption as genuine is not a question that psychology can answer. That is a moral question, and moral questions live in a different territory than psychological ones. Psychology can tell you that change is possible. It can tell you the conditions under which change is more or less likely. It can describe the mechanisms through which a person's attachment style, cognitive patterns, and moral frameworks can shift over time. But it cannot tell you that the changed person deserves forgiveness. Forgiveness is not owed. It is given, or not, by the people who were harmed. And their decision is valid regardless of how much the person who harmed them has changed. This is one of the things that makes Nolan's story so powerful. It does not ask you to forgive him. It does not present his arc as a simple redemption story where the bad guy becomes good and everyone is happy. It presents his arc as a messy, painful, incomplete process of psychological transformation that costs everyone involved, including Nolan himself. And it trusts you to sit with the discomfort of that, to hold two truths at the same time. The truth that Nolan did terrible things, and the truth that he became, eventually, a person who was capable of doing beautiful things. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. Before we move on, it is worth pausing on what Mark's experience of all this would look like from a psychological perspective. Because Nolan's psychology does not exist in isolation. It exists in relationship, and the relationship it exists in most intensely is the one with his son. Mark's psychological position throughout the series is one that clinicians would describe as profoundly disorienting. He is the child of an abuser who is also his hero. He is the victim of a betrayal that he can neither fully accept nor fully reject. And he is, whether he likes it or not, the person whose emotional response has the most power to influence whether his father changes. That is an enormous burden for anyone, let alone a teenager. There is a concept in family systems therapy called parentification, where a child is placed in the role of emotional caretaker for a parent. In the most common form, this involves a child managing a parent's emotional needs, becoming the stable one, the peacekeeper, the person who holds the family together while the parent cannot. Mark experiences a version of this that is twisted through the lens of superhuman violence and interplanetary politics. He is not managing his father's sadness or alcoholism or financial stress. He is managing his father's existential crisis, his ideological collapse, his capacity for mass violence. The emotional labor required of Mark is staggering in its scope, and the fact that he bears it at all, that he continues to engage with Nolan rather than simply cutting him off and walking away, says something important about both his character and his attachment style. A psychologist would note that Mark's willingness to keep reaching out to Nolan, even after the train, even after the near-death beating, even after everything that happened, is not simply a sign of exceptional moral goodness, although it is that too. It is also a sign of the anxious attachment that Nolan's inconsistent emotional availability created during Mark's childhood. Children who grow up with intermittently available parents learn, at a deep neurological level, that love requires effort. That connection requires persistence. That you do not give up on someone just because they have hurt you, because giving up means losing the possibility of the connection you need. This is, in some contexts, a tremendous strength, a source of resilience and loyalty that serves the person well throughout their life. In other contexts, it is a vulnerability, a pattern that keeps people in harmful relationships long past the point where leaving would be the healthier choice. And in Mark's case, it is both simultaneously. His persistence saves his father. His persistence may also be the thing that costs him the most psychological damage, because every time he reaches out and Nolan responds with Viltrumite coldness or dismissal or outright violence, the wound reopens. And wounds that are reopened repeatedly often take longer to heal than wounds that are allowed to close. The intergenerational transmission of trauma is another concept that applies powerfully here. Research has shown that the effects of trauma do not stop with the person who experienced the traumatic events. They propagate through families across generations, through parenting styles, through attachment patterns, through the subtle and not so subtle ways that traumatized people relate to their children and their partners. Nolan's Viltrumite conditioning, his avoidant attachment, his capacity for sudden and extreme violence, his emotional distance, all of these things shaped his parenting of Mark in ways both visible and invisible. And Mark absorbed those effects even before he had any idea what was causing them. The emotional distance that Nolan maintained during Mark's childhood, the careful metering of affection, the moments of inexplicable withdrawal when something triggered the Viltrumite identity, all of that left marks on Mark's developing psychology that will be with him for the rest of his life regardless of what Nolan does going forward. This is the thing about the intergenerational transmission of trauma. It does not require the transmitter to be intentional. It does not require them to be aware of what they are transmitting. It happens through the texture of daily life, through the micro interactions that accumulate silently over years, through the things that are felt in the body but never spoken aloud. And this is another reason why Nolan's story cannot be reduced to a simple redemption arc. Even if Nolan is fully and genuinely redeemed, even if he changes completely and irrevocably and becomes the best version of himself, the damage he did to Mark's psychological development during those formative years is done. It cannot be undone by subsequent good behavior. It can be worked with. It can be processed in therapy or through corrective relationships. Mark can develop his own earned security through his relationships with Amber, with Eve, with the people who show up for him consistently. But the original wound, the wound of having a father who was there but not fully there, who loved you but held something back, who turned out to be something you could never have imagined in your worst nightmares, that wound is permanent. It becomes part of the psychological landscape. Redemption does not erase damage. It does not undo what was done. It just changes the story you tell about it, and sometimes, for some people, that change in the story is enough. There is another lens through which a psychologist might examine Nolan, and it is one that gets to the heart of a debate that has been running through psychology for over a century: the nature versus nurture debate. Is Nolan a product of his biology or his environment? Is his capacity for Viltrumite genetics? Or is it learned, a product of centuries of cultural conditioning? The honest psychological answer is that the question itself is slightly wrong, because nature and nurture do not operate independently. They interact. Your genes do not determine your behavior. They determine the range of behaviors that are available to you, and your environment determines which of those behaviors actually develop. This is called the gene-environment interaction model, and it is one of the most important ideas in modern psychology. Viltrumites are genetically more powerful than humans. They live longer, they are stronger, they are more durable. These are biological facts within the fiction, and they would realistically have psychological consequences. A being who can destroy a city with their bare hands would inevitably develop a different relationship with power, with violence, and with consequence than a being who cannot. When you are functionally indestructible, the normal deterrents against violence, fear of injury, fear of retaliation, fear of consequences do not apply to you. And without those deterrents, the psychological barriers to violence are lower. Not absent, but lower. But this does not mean that Viltrumite violence is genetic destiny, because the show also gives us Mark. Mark has the same Viltrumite biology. He has the same potential for destructive power, but he does not use it the way Nolan does, because his environment was different. Mark was raised on Earth, with human values, with human relationships, with a moral framework that was not Viltrumite. And the result is a person who has Viltrumite power but human morality. Mark proves by his very existence that Viltrumite biology does not determine Viltrumite behavior. The violence is not in the genes, it is in the culture. And this is profoundly important for understanding Nolan's moral responsibility. Because if the violence were purely genetic, if Viltrumites were biologically compelled to conquer and dominate, then Nolan's moral responsibility would be diminished. You cannot blame someone for behavior they were biologically incapable of controlling. But that is not the case. The violence is cultural. It is learned. And learned behavior can be unlearned, which means that Nolan always had the capacity to choose differently. He just did not know it. There is a parallel here with the concept of toxic masculinity. although that term has become so overused and so politically charged that a psychologist would probably prefer a more precise formulation. The precise formulation is restrictive masculine norms, and it describes a set of cultural expectations around male behavior that discourage emotional expression, equate vulnerability with failure, and define manhood in terms of dominance, self-sufficiency, and the suppression of any feeling that might be interpreted as soft. Viltrumite culture is not merely restrictive in its masculine norms. It is the logical endpoint of restrictive masculine norms, taken to their most extreme and most destructive conclusion. Be strong. Do not feel. Conquer. And if you do feel, if some inconvenient emotion manages to survive the centuries of conditioning, and surfaces in your chest when your son looks at you with trust in his eyes, then crush it, because it will make you weak. And weakness in this framework is not just undesirable, it is fatal. Nolan's entire arc can be read as a story about a man who was raised inside the most extreme possible version of restrictive masculinity, and who, through contact with a world that operated on different principles, discovered that the restricting was destroying him. The strength was real, the power was real, but the restriction was killing something essential, something that turned out to be the most important part of him. And the tragedy is that the discovery came too late to prevent the damage, both the damage he did to others and the damage the restriction had done to him. This reading does not reduce Nolan's moral responsibility. Plenty of people are raised with restrictive masculine norms and do not massacre superhero teams or beat their children nearly to death. But it does add a layer of understanding, because restrictive masculinity does not just harm the people who are subjected to it by the men who practice it. It harms the men themselves. It cuts them off from their own emotional lives. It makes them strangers to their own feelings. And when those feelings finally break through, as they inevitably do, because you cannot suppress emotion indefinitely without consequences, the breakthrough is often violent, chaotic, and destructive. Not because the feelings themselves are violent, but because the person experiencing them has no framework for managing them. They have been trained to suppress, not to process, and suppression, when it fails catastrophically. This is what we see on the train. A man whose emotional suppression has failed catastrophically, surrounded by the wreckage of a coping strategy that was never sustainable in the first place. Mark is not the only evidence for this. Oliver is another. Oliver, Nolan's second son born on Thraxa to a non-human mother, raised in a very different context than either Nolan or Mark, develops his own relationship with violence and morality that is distinct from both of theirs. Oliver is more willing to use lethal force than Mark. He has fewer of the moral hesitations that constrain his brother. But he is not Nolan either. He is something else. A third data point that further demonstrates that Viltrumite biology provides a platform, but not a script. The script is written by experience, by culture, by the specific constellation of relationships and values that shape each individual life. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Nolan's psychology, and it is something that a psychologist would call the discovery of moral agency. Moral agency is the recognition that you are a moral actor, that your choices have ethical consequences, and that you are responsible for those consequences. It sounds simple, but for someone raised inside a totalistic ideology, it is revolutionary. Because totalistic ideologies, by design, eliminate the sense of individual moral agency. You do not make choices. The ideology makes choices through you. You are not a moral actor. You are an instrument of a moral system that is larger and more important than any individual. Nolan spent centuries without a sense of individual moral agency. The Empire decided. He executed. There was no space between the order and the action for something as inconvenient as a conscience. And then he spent 20 years on Earth, slowly, unconsciously, developing a conscience that he did not ask for, did not want, and could not control. The discovery of his own moral agency was not a liberation. It was a catastrophe, because once you realize that you are a moral actor, you also realize that every act of violence you committed while believing you were just an instrument was in fact a choice. Your choice. And the weight of that realization, the retroactive guilt of centuries, is almost unimaginable. This is another reason why the train scene is so extreme. Nolan is not just fighting Mark. He is fighting his own emerging conscience. He is trying to destroy the moral awareness that is growing inside him, because that awareness is unbearable. If he can force Mark to submit, if he can make the Viltrumite logic work, then he does not have to face the implications of his own moral agency. He does not have to look back at centuries of conquest and see choices where he used to see orders. He does not have to be responsible. But Mark's refusal makes the avoidance impossible. And Nolan's flight from Earth is, in psychological terms, a flight from moral consciousness itself. There is something else that a psychologist would notice about Nolan, and it is related to the concept of narcissistic personality traits. Note the word traits, not disorder. This is an important distinction. Narcissistic personality disorder is a clinical diagnosis with specific diagnostic criteria, and applying it casually to fictional characters, or real people for that matter, is not responsible psychology. But narcissistic traits, which exist on the spectrum and are present in the general population to varying degrees, are very relevant to Nolan's character. Narcissistic traits include grandiosity, a sense of entitlement, a lack of empathy, a need for admiration, and a tendency to exploit others for personal gain. Nolan exhibits several of these traits, but the question is whether they are intrinsic to his personality or whether they are products of his conditioning. And a psychologist would argue that for Nolan, the narcissistic traits are largely cultural rather than characterological. Viltrumite culture is, by its nature, a narcissistic culture. It teaches its members that they are superior to all other beings. It rewards grandiosity and punishes humility. It encourages exploitation and discourages empathy. Growing up in that culture, it would be almost impossible not to develop narcissistic traits. But the key indicator of whether those traits are characterological, meaning deeply embedded in the person's psychological structure, or cultural, meaning imposed from outside and potentially modifiable, is what happens when the cultural reinforcement is removed. And what happens when Nolan is removed from Viltrumite culture is that the narcissistic traits begin to erode, slowly, unevenly, with significant resistance. But they do erode. He begins to show genuine empathy, something that a person with true narcissistic personality disorder would find almost impossible. He begins to experience shame, which is distinct from guilt, and which narcissistic individuals typically avoid at all costs. He begins to value other people not for what they can do for him, but for who they are. These are signs that the narcissistic presentation was cultural rather than characterological. The person underneath the conditioning is capable of empathy. He just needed the conditioning to crack before the empathy could emerge. The distinction between guilt and shame is worth pausing on here, because it is relevant to Nolan's psychology and to the larger question of whether he can truly change. Guilt is the feeling that you have done something bad. Shame is the feeling that you are something bad. Guilt says, I made a terrible mistake. Shame says, I am a terrible person. Both are painful, but they lead in different directions. Guilt, when it is not overwhelming, can motivate repair. It can push you to make amends, to do better, to change the behavior that caused the harm. Shame, by contrast, tends to motivate withdrawal, defensiveness, or aggression. When you feel that you are fundamentally bad, the impulse is not to fix things but to hide, to deny, or to lash out at the people who are making you feel the shame. Nolan experiences both guilt and shame over the course of his arc, and the interplay between them is one of the most psychologically realistic aspects of his character. There are moments when the guilt is productive, when it motivates him to protect people, to fight for Mark, to act in ways that are inconsistent with his Viltrumite programming. And there are moments when the shame takes over, when the enormity of what he has done collapses in on him, and he becomes defensive, cold, or withdrawn. The oscillation between guilt and shame is a hallmark of someone who is in the middle of a genuine psychological transformation. It is messy, it is unpredictable, and it is real. And the conditioning did crack. Earth cracked it, Debbie cracked it. 20 years of being loved imperfectly and incompletely by people who did not know what he was but who loved the person they thought he was, cracked something that centuries of Viltrumite conditioning had sealed shut. And what came out was messy and painful and destructive, because psychological breakthroughs are not clean. They are violent. They tear things open. They make things worse before they make things better. But they make things better, eventually. Sometimes, if the person is willing to stay in the discomfort long enough to grow. This brings us to the final psychological framework that is essential for understanding Nolan, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable one. It is the psychology of perpetrator trauma. Perpetrator trauma is a relatively new area of study, and it is controversial because it asks us to consider the psychological damage experienced by people who have committed harmful acts. This is not the same as feeling sorry for them. It is not about redirecting sympathy from victims to perpetrators. It is about recognizing a psychological reality, that doing terrible things damages the person who does them, even if they appear unaffected on the surface. Research on perpetrator trauma, much of it conducted with military veterans, has shown that killing, even in contexts where it is legally and socially sanctioned, creates lasting psychological damage. This damage is distinct from the trauma of being victimized. It involves a specific kind of moral injury, a wound to the person's sense of themselves as a moral being, and it manifests in ways that are sometimes invisible, emotional numbing, inability to form close relationships, hypervigilance, substance use, self-destructive behavior, and, crucially, an inability to forgive oneself, which can persist for decades after the harmful acts were committed. Moral injury is a term that has become increasingly important in clinical psychology, particularly in the treatment of veterans. It refers to the lasting psychological damage that occurs when a person perpetrates, fails to prevent, or witnesses events that transgress their deeply held moral beliefs. The key word is transgress. Moral injury does not occur when you do something that someone else considers wrong. It occurs when you do something that you consider wrong, even if you did not know it at the time. And this is precisely what happens to Nolan when his conscience emerges. Every act of violence that he committed while operating under Viltrumite ideology retroactively becomes a moral injury once the ideology fails. The acts have not changed. His understanding of them has, and that retroactive reframing is devastating because it means that his entire history is suddenly populated with moral injuries that he was not even aware of when they were being inflicted. Nolan has centuries of perpetrator trauma. Centuries. The psychological weight of that is almost beyond comprehension. Every planet conquered, every civilization destroyed, every being killed. All of it sitting inside him, unprocessed, because the Viltrumite framework that was supposed to make it all acceptable has been shattered. The ideology that said all of that was justified is gone. And what is left is a man with centuries of memories that he now understands with his newly developed conscience were centuries of choices that he made, not the Empire, him. The temptation to retreat back into the ideology is enormous. It would be so much easier to go back to believing that it was all justified, that the conquered deserved to be conquered, that strength is virtue, that he was just following orders. The cognitive load of maintaining moral consciousness in the face of centuries of perpetration is staggering. And the fact that Nolan does not retreat, the fact that he stays in the discomfort and continues to move toward the identity of father rather than the identity of warrior, is either a testament to the strength of his attachment to Mark or a sign that some transformations, once they begin, cannot be reversed. A psychologist might call it both. The attachment drives the transformation, and the transformation, once underway, develops its own momentum. Neural pathways that have been activated cannot be easily deactivated. Once you have experienced genuine empathy, you cannot unfeel it. Once you have recognized your own moral agency, you cannot unknow it. The genie does not go back in the bottle. And this is why Nolan's death in the comics is not merely a sacrifice. It is a psychological resolution. For centuries, Nolan existed in a state of fragmentation, warrior and father, Viltrumite and human, conqueror and parent. His entire adult life was defined by the tension between these irreconcilable identities, and his death, fighting to protect his family, is the moment when the fragmentation ends. Not because one identity won and the other lost, but because, in that final act, both identities are expressed simultaneously. The warrior's strength is placed in the service of the father's love. The power that was supposed to be used for conquest is used, instead, for protection. The two selves are, for the first and last time, aligned. That alignment is what psychologists call integration. And integration, in the clinical sense, is the goal of all psychological healing. Not the elimination of unwanted parts of the self, but the reconciliation of all parts into a coherent whole. You do not heal by killing the parts of yourself that you are ashamed of. You heal by finding a way for all of your parts to work together. Nolan's final act is integration. The warrior is not destroyed. The warrior's strength, discipline, and willingness to endure pain are essential to the act of sacrifice. But those qualities are no longer in the service of an ideology of dominance. They are in the service of love. And that changes everything. It does not fix everything. The dead are still dead. The damage is still real, but it changes the meaning. And in psychology, meaning is everything. The same event can be trauma or growth, depending on the meaning you assign to it. Nolan's life, viewed through one lens, is a story of a monster who pretended to be human and eventually went back to being a monster. Viewed through another lens, it is a story of a person who was made into a monster and spent the last portion of his long life trying to become something else. Neither lens is wrong, but the second one is more complete. And completeness, in psychology as in storytelling, is its own form of truth. There is one more thing worth considering, and it is something that sits at the boundary of psychology and philosophy. It is the question of whether Nolan's final sacrifice was an act of genuine altruism or the ultimate expression of his own need. Was he dying for his family, or was he dying for himself? Was the sacrifice selfless, or was it the only way he could live with who he had become? The honest answer is probably both, and that is not a contradiction. One of the insights of modern psychology is that the boundary between selfish and selfless motivation is much blurrier than our moral intuitions suggest. When a parent sacrifices for their child, they are doing something for the child, but they are also doing something that their identity as a parent demands. The sacrifice serves the child and it serves the self, because the self has been constructed in a way that makes the child's welfare inseparable from its own integrity. Nolan's sacrifice for Mark is simultaneously an act of love and an act of self-completion. He is protecting his son and he is becoming the person he needs to be. Both things are happening at the same time, and neither reduces the other. There is also the matter of J.K. Simmons' performance, which deserves psychological attention of its own, because it is one of the key reasons Nolan's inner life feels as real as it does. Voice acting, stripped of the physical cues that live-action performers rely on, has to carry emotion entirely through tone, pacing, breath, and the subtle textures of vocalization. And Simmons does something extraordinary with Nolan. He gives the character a vocal quality that shifts depending on which identity is in control. When the warrior is dominant, the voice is low, measured, authoritative. There is a flatness to it, an absence of emotional overtones that communicates the effective blunting of a person who has trained himself not to feel. When the father is dominant, the voice warms, it becomes slightly less controlled. There are micro-hesitations, tiny catches in the breath, that suggest a person who is encountering his own feelings in real time and is not quite sure what to do with them. And when both identities are active simultaneously, as in the train scene, the voice becomes something else entirely. It fractures, it pitches upward, it oscillates between command and plea. It sounds like a person who is arguing with himself, which is exactly what is happening. This is, in the end, the deepest psychological truth about Nolan Grayson. He is not a character who moves from bad to good on a simple continuum. He is a character who discovers, after centuries of being one thing, that he is also another thing, and then spends the rest of his life trying to figure out how both things can exist inside the same person. The answer turns out to be painful, costly, and ultimately fatal. But it is an answer, and the fact that he reaches it at all, given where he started, is remarkable. But before we arrive at the final accounting, there are several more psychological lenses worth holding up to Nolan, because his story is one of those rare fictions that rewards every angle you bring to it. And some of these angles illuminate corners of his psychology that the more familiar frameworks leave in shadow. One of them is Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. Erikson proposed that human beings move through 8 stages of psychological growth across the lifespan, and each stage presents a central conflict that the person must resolve in order to develop in a healthy direction. The stages are sequential. You do not skip them, and the way you resolve each one shapes how you approach the next. For Nolan, the most relevant stage is the 7th, which Erikson called generativity versus stagnation. This stage typically occurs during middle adulthood, and its central question is deceptively simple. Have you created something that will outlast you? Have you contributed to the next generation? Have you made something that matters? Generativity in Erikson's framework is not limited to parenthood. It can express itself through mentorship, through creative work, through community involvement, through any activity that connects you to the future in a meaningful way. The virtue that emerges from successfully navigating this stage is care, which Erikson defined as the capacity to take responsibility for the persons, the products, and the ideas you have learned to value. Stagnation, by contrast, is what happens when a person fails to develop this sense of contribution. It manifests as self-absorption, as a feeling of emptiness, as the growing awareness that your life has not produced anything that will survive you. Now, Nolan is not a human being moving through a human lifespan, so applying Erikson's stages to him requires some adaptation. But the psychological dynamics are surprisingly apt. Because the question of generativity versus stagnation is, in many ways, the hidden engine of Nolan's entire arc. Consider what his life looked like before Earth. Centuries of conquest, centuries of acquisition, planet after planet absorbed into the Viltrumite Empire. And none of it, not a single conquest, produced anything that Nolan could call his own. The planets were not his, they belonged to the Empire. The victories were not personal, they were institutional. Nolan was, for all his power, an instrument. And instruments do not experience generativity, they experience use. This is the psychological trap of totalistic service to an ideology. The ideology promises meaning through participation. You matter because you serve. Your life has purpose because the mission has purpose. But the meaning is borrowed. It is not yours. And if the ideology ever falters, if the mission ever comes into question, the borrowed meaning evaporates, and what is left is stagnation. Profound, centuries-deep stagnation. A life of enormous activity that produced nothing personally meaningful. Nolan conquered worlds, but he did not create anything. He expanded an empire, but he did not build anything that carried his own signature. He was powerful, but he was not generative. And the difference between power and generativity is the difference between dominating the world and contributing to it. Then Mark was born, and for the first time in Nolan's long existence, he created something. Not conquered, not acquired. Created a child who was part of him and part of the world he had come to inhabit. A living connection between who he was and what the future might hold. Mark was, whether Nolan recognized it consciously or not, the first genuinely generative act of his life. And the psychological significance of that cannot be overstated, because generativity, once experienced, changes the architecture of the self. It shifts your orientation from the past to the future. It gives you a stake in what comes next. And for someone who had spent centuries with no personal stake in anything, that shift was seismic. This is part of why Nolan could not kill Mark on that mountain, not just because of love, although love was the proximate cause, but because killing Mark would have been the destruction of his only generative achievement. It would have been the final confirmation of stagnation, the proof that centuries of life had produced nothing that deserved to survive. And somewhere inside him, in a place deeper than ideology and older than conditioning, something refused that conclusion. Something insisted that the thing he had created mattered more than the mission he had been given. There is another framework that deserves attention here, and it speaks to the specific nature of Nolan's bond with Mark in a way that the general attachment theory discussion only partially captures. It is the concept of disorganized attachment, not as a style that Nolan exhibits, but as the experience he creates for Mark. We discussed earlier that Mark's attachment to Nolan appears anxious secure, but there is a strong argument that during and after the reveal, what Mark experiences is closer to disorganized attachment in its purest and most devastating form. Disorganized attachment arises when the person who is supposed to be your primary source of safety becomes simultaneously your primary source of fear. The caregiver is both the haven and the threat, and the child, or in this case the adolescent, is caught in a paradox that has no resolution. The person you instinctively run toward for protection is the person you need protection from. Research on disorganized attachment describes the behavioral signature it produces in children. They approach and then freeze. They reach out and then pull back. They move toward the caregiver and then turn away mid-step, as if two contradictory impulses are fighting for control of the same body at the same time. And this is precisely what you see in Mark's behavior after the reveal. He wants to fight Nolan, and he wants to save him. He wants to hate his father, and he cannot stop loving him. He approaches and retreats, confronts and forgives, rages and grieves, sometimes within the same scene. The oscillation is not indecision. It is the behavioral expression of a bond that has been fractured into contradictory pieces that cannot be reassembled into a coherent whole. The psychological literature describes the core of disorganized attachment as fright without solution. The child is frightened, and the natural response to fright is to seek proximity to the attachment figure. But the attachment figure is the source of the fright. So the child is trapped in a loop. Run to the parent. Be frightened by the parent. Need to run to someone for comfort. The only available someone is the parent. The system crashes, and in that crash, something fundamental breaks in the way the child organizes their understanding of relationships. Trust becomes conditional and unpredictable. Safety becomes a concept that cannot be relied upon. And love becomes something that carries, always and inevitably, the possibility of destruction. Mark carries this with him. You can see it in the way he interacts with Nolan in every scene after the first season. There is a vigilance that was not there before. A readiness to flinch that coexists with the readiness to embrace. He is never fully relaxed in his father's presence, and he is never fully able to walk away from it. That is what disorganized attachment looks like in an older person. Not the freezing and approaching of an infant, but the chronic uncertainty of someone who has learned that the people they love most are also the people most capable of annihilating them. There is yet another psychological dimension to Nolan's story that is worth exploring, and it is one that connects his individual psychology to a broader and much older question in the study of human behavior. It is the psychology of defection, the question of what makes a person betray the group that formed them. Defection is one of the most studied phenomena in social psychology, game theory, and political science, and the research on it converges on a set of consistent findings. People defect from their groups for reasons that are almost never purely ideological. A former CIA psychiatrist who spent decades studying real-world defectors from intelligence services and military organizations observed that personal crisis is the single strongest predictor of defection. Nobody defects because they are happy. They defect because something in their personal life has become intolerable. And the defection is a response to that intolerability, not a calm intellectual reassessment of their group's values. This maps onto Nolan's experience with startling precision. Nolan does not defect from the Viltrumite Empire because he sits down one day and rationally concludes that Viltrumite ideology is wrong. He defects because his personal life has created a set of attachments that make continued loyalty to the Empire psychologically impossible. The defection is driven by emotion, by attachment, by the specific personal crisis of discovering that he loves his son more than he loves his mission. The intellectual reckoning comes later, if it comes at all. The initial break is visceral, not rational. It is driven by the heart, not the head. And this is consistent with what the research tells us about how defection actually works in the real world. There is also a social cost to defection that the research emphasizes, and it is a cost that Nolan pays in full. Groups punish defectors more harshly than they punish outsiders who were never members. An enemy is expected to oppose you. A defector chose to oppose you, and that choice is experienced as a deeper and more personal betrayal. The Viltrumite Empire's response to Nolan's defection is not merely strategic, it is viscerally punitive. He is not simply a problem to be managed, he is a traitor to be destroyed. And the intensity of that response reflects a psychological truth about how groups process betrayal from within. The defector has violated a normative expectation of loyalty that is felt by the group as a wound to its collective identity. The punishment is not proportionate to the strategic threat. It is proportionate to the emotional injury. Nolan, in choosing his family over his civilization, accepts this punishment. He accepts that he will be hunted. He accepts that his former allies will become his most dangerous enemies. He accepts that the identity he carried for centuries will be not merely abandoned, but actively despised by every Viltrumite who learns of his choice. And the psychological weight of that acceptance is enormous. Defection is not just a change of allegiance. It is a severance from every social bond, every shared history, every relationship that was formed within the context of the group. It is a kind of social death, and Nolan walks into that death with his eyes open, because the alternative, the death of his bond with Mark, is worse. This brings us to a question that has been hovering at the edges of this entire discussion, and it is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. It is the question of grief, and specifically the question of what Nolan grieves after leaving Earth. The obvious answer is that he grieves his family, Debbie, Mark, the life he built, and that is true. But a psychologist would point out that Nolan is grieving something much larger than a family. He is grieving an entire identity. He is grieving the Viltrumite self that carried him for centuries. He is grieving the certainty that came with that identity, the clarity of purpose, the freedom from moral ambiguity. He is grieving the simplicity of a worldview where strength was the only thing that mattered, and where questions of right and wrong were already answered by the ideology. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance have been widely misunderstood as a linear progression. They are not. They are a set of responses that can occur in any order, overlap, recur, and persist indefinitely. And Nolan's post-Earth behavior maps onto several of them simultaneously. The flight to Thraxa has elements of denial, an attempt to rebuild what was lost without addressing why it was lost. His confrontations with Viltrumite authority have elements of anger directed outward at the system that made him what he was. His attempts to be a better father to Oliver have elements of bargaining, as if being better this time might compensate for what he did last time. And his quieter moments, the moments when the weight of everything settles on him and he simply exists inside the pain without trying to escape it, those are depression in the clinical sense, not sadness, not moodiness. The heavy, gray, airless exhaustion of a person who has lost something so fundamental that the world itself feels diminished. But the grief that a psychologist would find most interesting is not the grief for his family or the grief for his identity. It is the grief for his innocence, not moral innocence, but psychological innocence, the state of not knowing what you are capable of. Before the train, Nolan could tell himself, however implausibly, that he was in control, that the warrior and the father could be managed, that the contradictions could be contained. After the train, that innocence was gone. He knew, with the certainty of lived experience, that he was capable of holding his own son's body in front of a speeding train while civilians died around them. He knew that the violence inside him was not theoretical. It was actual, and you cannot unknow that about yourself. The knowledge sits inside you like a stone, and every day you carry it, and it never gets lighter. This is what clinicians call moral injury, and we touched on it earlier, but it deserves a deeper treatment here because it is central to understanding Nolan's psychology after the train. Moral injury, as defined by researchers at Syracuse University and the National Center for PTSD, is the disruption in a person's confidence and expectations about their own capacity to behave in a just and ethical manner. It is not the same as PTSD, although it often co-occurs with it. PTSD is a response to threat. Moral injury is a response to transgression. PTSD says, something terrible happened to me. Moral injury says, I did something terrible, or I failed to prevent something terrible, and I cannot reconcile that with who I thought I was. The hallmark emotional responses to moral injury are guilt, shame, disgust, and anger. And all four of these are visible in Nolan's behavior after the train. The guilt manifests as a compulsive need to protect, to compensate, to prove through action that he is not what the train revealed him to be. The shame manifests as withdrawal, as the inability to face the people he hurt, as the years of distance from Earth that are not just avoidance but a form of self-exile driven by the conviction that he does not deserve to be near the people he loves. The disgust manifests as a turning away from the Viltrumite identity, a visceral revulsion at what that identity produced. And the anger manifests in multiple directions, at the Empire for making him what he was, at himself for what he did with it, and sometimes, unfairly but understandably, at Mark for being the catalyst that forced the reckoning. Research with military veterans has shown that moral injury is particularly devastating when the transgressive act was committed against someone the perpetrator was supposed to protect. A soldier who kills an enemy combatant may experience moral injury, but a soldier who inadvertently harms a civilian, especially a child, experiences a qualitatively different and more severe form of moral wounding. The violation is not just of abstract moral principles. It is of the specific relational duty of protection. And for Nolan, the train scene is a violation of the most fundamental relational duty that exists, the duty of a parent to protect their child. He did not just harm civilians. He used his son's body as a weapon against them. He turned the relationship of protection into an instrument of violence. And the moral injury from that is not something that time heals. It is something that time merely teaches you to carry. There is one more question that a psychologist would want to address before we arrive at any kind of conclusion about Nolan, and it is a question that reframes everything we have discussed so far. It is the question of whether Nolan's love for humanity, and for his family specifically, represents genuine psychological transformation, or whether it is better understood through the lens of capture, specifically the kind of psychological capture that occurs when a person's environment gradually reshapes their identity without their conscious awareness or consent. This is, in essence, the Stockholm Syndrome question applied not to Debbie, but to Nolan himself. And it is a more unsettling question than it first appears, because the argument can be made that Nolan did not choose to love his family. He was captured by them. Not through force, not through intimidation, but through the slow, relentless neurological process of identity absorption that we discussed earlier. The 20 years of pretending rewired his brain. The cover identity became load-bearing, and by the time Nolan realized what had happened, it was too late. The love was already there, already embedded, already structural. He did not choose it any more than a person with Stockholm Syndrome chooses to bond with their captor. It happened to him. If you take this reading seriously, it changes the moral calculus in complicated ways. Because if Nolan's love for Mark is not a choice but a product of psychological capture, then his defection from the Viltrumite Empire is not an act of moral courage. It is a symptom, and his apparent redemption is not a genuine transformation of values, but a replacement of one form of psychological bondage with another. He was a prisoner of Viltrumite ideology, and now he is a prisoner of human attachment. The cage changed, the captivity did not. But a psychologist would push back on this reading, and the pushback is important, because the distinction between genuine transformation and psychological capture may be less meaningful than it appears. All love is, at some level, a form of capture. All deep attachment involves the gradual reshaping of identity through sustained emotional experience. When you love someone for 20 years, your brain changes. Your neural pathways reorganize around the relationship. Your sense of self becomes entangled with the other person. This is not pathology. This is what love does. It is what love is. The question is not whether Nolan was captured by his love for his family. The question is whether being captured by love is fundamentally different from choosing love. And the honest psychological answer is that the boundary between those two things is much thinner than we would like to believe. We all like to think that our deepest commitments are choices, that we love the people we love because we decided to. But the developmental research suggests something more complicated. Our capacity for love is shaped by our earliest experiences. Our attachment patterns are laid down before we have the cognitive development to choose anything. And the people we love, the ways we love them, and the intensity with which we feel that love are all products of neural architecture that was built without our conscious participation. In this sense, all love is a kind of capture, and Nolan's experience, while more dramatic in its specifics, is not categorically different from the experience of any person who has ever been surprised by the depth of their own feelings. The distinction that matters psychologically is not between chosen love and captured love. It is between love that leads to growth and love that leads to stagnation, love that expands the self and love that contracts it, love that makes you more capable of empathy and love that makes you less. And by this measure, Nolan's love for his family, however it originated, is genuine because it expanded him. It made him capable of feelings he had never experienced before. It gave him a conscience. It gave him moral agency. It gave him the capacity for sacrifice. These are not the products of pathological capture. These are the products of a relationship that, despite its fraudulent origins, produced authentic growth. And perhaps that is the most psychologically honest thing we can say about Nolan's love. It was real not because of how it started, but because of what it produced. The origins were false. The growth was genuine. And the person who emerged from that growth, flawed, guilty, carrying centuries of moral injury, but capable, finally, of choosing his son over his empire, that person was not a puppet of neurological conditioning. That person was someone new, someone who had never existed before, someone who was, in the most literal psychological sense, born on Earth in a kitchen that smelled like coffee, on a Tuesday morning when his son reached up and something shifted inside him that could never shift back. So what would a psychologist ultimately say about Omni Man? They would say that he is a case study in the limits of indoctrination, that centuries of conditioning can be undone, but the undoing is not clean, and it leaves wreckage. They would say that attachment is more powerful than ideology, but that power is not always a good thing, because the same attachment that saves can also destroy, depending on what the attached person does with it. They would say that moral agency is both a liberation and a burden, and that the discovery of your own capacity to choose is, for someone who has spent a lifetime believing they were merely an instrument, one of the most destabilizing experiences possible. They would say that Nolan is not a narcissist. He is a traumatized person with narcissistic traits that were imposed by a narcissistic culture. And the gradual erosion of those traits under the influence of genuine human connection is one of the most psychologically realistic aspects of his character. They would say that his relationship with Debbie is a study in betrayal trauma, and that her response to the revelation of his true identity is one of the most honest depictions of that particular kind of pain that exists in popular media. They would say that his relationship with Mark is a study in the possibility of earned secure attachment, and that Mark's stubborn refusal to abandon the relationship, even after everything, is the single most important factor in Nolan's transformation. They would say that the train scene is not gratuitous violence. It is the visible manifestation of an internal psychological catastrophe. It is what decompensation looks like when the person decompensating has the power to destroy everything around them. And they would say that Nolan's line, "Why did you make me do this?" is one of the most psychologically loaded sentences in modern fiction, because it encapsulates in 7 words the entire dynamic of abuse, denial, and the terror of moral responsibility. And they would say, finally, that Nolan's story does not answer the question of whether redemption is possible. It holds the question open. It shows you a person who did terrible things and then spent the rest of his life trying to become someone who would not do those things. And it asks you to decide, for yourself, whether the trying is enough, whether change is redemption or merely change, whether the person Nolan became at the end was a new person, or the same person who killed the Guardians with a slightly different coat of paint. Psychology does not have a final answer to that question. Neither does Invincible. And that, more than anything else, is what makes the story worth thinking about. It does not tell you what to feel about Nolan Grayson. It gives you the tools to feel something complicated. And sometimes, the most honest thing a story can do is refuse to be simple. There is a moment, right at the beginning, where Nolan stood over his son and screamed, not in rage, but in recognition. Recognition that the person he thought he was had already died, and the person he was becoming did not yet have a name. That space between identities, that void where the old self has ended and the new self has not yet arrived, is one of the most terrifying places a human being can inhabit. Or in Nolan's case, a Viltrumite. If you made it this far, thank you. Truly. And if you want more of these kinds of deep, quiet explorations of the characters and stories that stick with you, subscribing really is the best way to make sure we keep going. It costs nothing, and it means, now, close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let your breathing slow. And if you find yourself thinking about fathers and sons, about the masks we wear and the ones that grow into our skin, let those thoughts drift. They will be there in the morning if you want them. For now, just rest.